Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Cyril Ramaphosa was asked about broad-based black economic empowerment in the questions to the president's session on Tuesday, and he snapped. The man was not happy with the question, and the answer that he gave was one of the most passionate answers that he's ever given in that chamber. BEE has been getting lots of scrutiny and criticism in recent days. There's always been negative rhetoric around BEE, especially from right-wing voices, but not exclusively from them. But it feels, I don't know if you've been noticing the same thing, that the volume went up this year, and it has been coming up even louder and louder after Donald Trump was inaugurated. Elon Musk in particular has been one of the biggest critics of BEE in recent days. He has said that he could not operate Starlink in South Africa because he's not a black man. Elon has been one of the people encouraging and emboldening the criticism of South Africa online and of affirmative action policies. More right-wing voices have generally started making content about South Africa in the last few weeks. I don't know if you've noticed this. These podcasters, Ben Shapiro, Matt Welsh, all of these guys have made PBD, Patrick Bet-David. They've made thousands of videos. They've never bothered to speak on South Africa. But in the last few weeks, there's been a plethora of content around South Africa. All of a sudden, they've started caring about the conditions in South Africa. And they don't seem to care about the holistic conditions of all South Africans, just in particular, some groups of South Africans. And also, they always seem to gloss over actually what happened during apartheid, the atrocities that were committed, and the nature and the extent of the brutality. People like Jordan Peterson have been making content about South Africa, making it seem as if mistakes were made in the transition to democracy and in the model that was followed. All of these people speaking out of the side of their mouth without knowledge, without full appreciation. I don't know if you've noticed that. I've noticed it, but I don't know if you have too. Let's go back to, because it makes me wonder, before I go back to Parliament, it makes me wonder if it's all coordinated, if Elon is doing something, or if there's a WhatsApp group somewhere where everyone was told, it's game time, let's start putting South Africa on the right-wing podcast map, so to speak. Let's go back to Parliament. Mr. Ramaphosa was asked about BEE, and he was very passionate in his defense of BEE. This is what went down in Parliament. I'm going to play the clip, then I'm going to come back and give some thoughts about his answer, context, history of the legislation, and then we're going to do a nice episode of The Dissection on this topic. But here's the question and the answer as Mr. Ramaphosa was asked by someone from the Freedom Front Plus, Mr. Mulder.
And if there's one thing that the Government of National Unity, I think, have in common is the commitment to economic growth. And a lot of things, the things that you mentioned this afternoon is in terms of Operation Vulindlela. And we accept that. And if I understand it correctly, it means to open the way, but the way is not open. There's a problem with the way, with all due respect. I want to say that if you look at the World Bank's report, it clearly indicates that the average growth at the moment for developing countries is around 4%. If you look at the top 10 African countries, the growth rates there vary between the lowest 5.9% to 7.9%. Even in terms of all the things that you have now mentioned this afternoon, your own Minister of Finance in the budget last week indicated that our current growth rate is 1.4. Hopefully next year, 1.6. Despite all the programs, hopefully in the year thereafter, 1.8%. Our unemployment is 32%. Something is wrong. There's a huge problem. And the problem, Honorable President, is that all the issues that you mentioned, all the wonderful programs and the investments, as far as I'm concerned, are based on the current economic policy of government, the underlying economic policy. Now, that's why I asked the question specifically. Are you prepared to take the initiative and to take the necessary steps to amend, to develop an economic policy that can make possible real economic growth in South Africa? Because that's what we need. If we don't have real economic growth, none of the programs that you've mentioned will be successful. None of them will be implemented. But that real new economic policy, as far as I'm concerned, needs to take a different approach with regard to certain basic things that I don't know if you're prepared to do that with regard to black economic empowerment, with regard to equity, employment equity.
Thank you, Honourable Mulder. Your time has expired.
Preparation without compensation. Are you prepared to do that? Thank you, sir.
The President.
Thank you, Honorable Deputy Speaker. I did say that the Government of National Unity is going to spend a considerable amount of hours in a number of days to come just discussing the economics strategy and trajectory that we should pursue. Our ambition, Honorable Member, Dr. Mulder, is to make sure that our economy grows higher than what the projections are currently. That is our ambition. And the medium-term development plan gives the pointers of where we should be going. What the Minister of Finance also articulated on this platform also gives the pointers of where we are headed. And I'm rather surprised and taken aback when I hear that policies of Black economic empowerment militate against the growth of our economy. That I find quite surprising, because I work from the starting point that our economy was held back over many years by the racist policies of the past. Those racist policies prevented all South Africans, or the majority of South Africans, to play a meaningful role in the economy of their own country. They were brought in, Black people were brought in as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And they were just brought in as laborers. They were not even seen as consumers. They were not seen as active players in the economic landscape of our country. With democracy, what has now been happening, and what we seek to see happening, is the opening up of the economy, the broadening up of economic participation, which, if you observe Honorable Dr. Mulder, you will actually see, and it's right in your face. You know, in apartheid South Africa, if you looked, for instance, at adverts for commodities, you would never see a Black person being made to advertise either soap or milk or anything. Today, every advert you look at has got Black people, because it's now been realized that it is Black people who are the consumers, and they are economic players. Now, those who would want Black people just to play the consumer role are truly mistaken. Black people must play a productive role as well. So I am really baffled. I'm baffled by people who still hanker for policies of the past. And to have you, sir, saying Black economic empowerment is holding our economy back goes completely against even what the World Bank says. Now, this I find quite surprising, because what is known very clearly as well is that, and a few years ago, the World Bank and the IMF came up with a report that one of the things that holds South Africa's economy back from growth is the level of concentration. Concentration, because they said the ownership of the economy is in far too few hands. Ownership has not spread. That is what the World Bank and IMF said. And that is precisely what happens in other countries. When you go to other countries, you'll find the citizens. I mean, in Africa, it will largely be Black people. Wherever you go in the world, it will be the citizens. Now, in our country, it was just the few privileged, and may I continue to say white people, who continue to own the means of production, who continue to own the productive economy of our country. Now,
We took them to America.
Now, this I find very worrying. I find it very worrying that we continue to have this notion that BEE is the one that's holding our economy back. It is the partial and exclusive ownership of the means of production in our country that is holding this economy from growing. So, what we seek to do, as set out in the Equality Clause in our Constitution, to redress the imbalances of the past. If we accept that the ownership of our economy is imbalanced, the clause on equality in our Constitution seeks to undo that, to redress that. So therefore, ownership of our economy should be broadened. And I can tell you, Dr. Mulder, there's nothing that gives our people joy, particularly Black people, as they go around and they find that this production facility is owned by a Black person. It warms one's heart. It makes us feel so good because we've come from a horrible past when that was not allowed by law, where people were arrested. If you wanted to set up an economic facility in town, you were put to jail. But today, we are saying all that must be put behind us. We must allow more and more people to play an important role in the economy of our country. And this is what baffles me by those who are opposed to Black economic empowerment. I say, what do you want to see happening? Do you want to see Black people continuing to play the role of laborers, drawers of water, hewers of wood, and consumers only? Why can't Black people be made to own productive aspects of our economy? Why can't they be rich as well? That is what needs to happen. Because it is when they get to that level. Dr. Mulder, you look at the Afrikaners, the history of your people. If you look at the history of your people, they were held back by the English. And with later days, they were enabled. They became more and more economically empowered. And they became economically empowered due to the policies of apartheid, the laws that were put in place, the sweet deals that they were given, and they started getting more and more into being serious economic players. Why can't the same be done for Black people? Why? And this baffles me. Really, I don't understand it, because to me, that is the normal thing to do. You need, as a nation, to say, this group has been disempowered. It's been disempowered. We need to empower it. Like the approach we have now, the rural areas of our country have been disadvantaged, and we're seeking to direct more and more assistance and empowerment to the rural areas, so that the rural areas also come up. Now, anyone who will tell me that that is wrong, really, I think they must have their heads examined, because that cannot be the case. So, my answer, therefore, is our objective is to spread economic participation broadly. And I will hold on to the argument that the more we have previously disadvantaged people playing a role in the economy of their own country, the better it is.
No,
Because then
don't
we are able to bake a much bigger cake so that everyone participates in having the cake. Thank you very much.
Some people are saying, why didn't Mr. Ramaphosa speak like this in the White House when he was next to Donald Trump? Why didn't he have this energy in the White House? Mr. Ramaphosa, why didn't you have the energy? it seems like since his return from Washington, Mr. Ramaphosa has been talking much tougher. Perhaps this is because of the reception in South Africa of that particular Washington trip, which was not overwhelmingly celebratory. Of course, ANC guys did try to spin the story and say, no, it was successful, etc. But many people were not impressed. The Oval Office showdown was not viewed as a slam dunk by many people. And many people have even been questioning the preparation, the lack of pushback, the role of Ronald Lamola, Pakstau, and Khumbudzo Ntshavheni on the couch. They were the couch ministers, the couch potatoes, if you will. So people are like, what was Lamola doing there except to be tapped on the shoulder by Rupert, who says, this is my good boy who has changed his mind and doesn't think dangerous things anymore. So people are not impressed. The rhetoric of Johan Rupert, the role of Johan Rupert, the intentions of Elon Musk, the conversations about Starlink, the Starlink issue is not landing well. And Mr. Ramaphosa would be aware of this. This could be what is making him take a tougher tone in his public remarks. He was even defending the singing of the song, saying, look, our courts have ruled on this issue. It's a historical song, something which has annoyed and irritated the right-wing movements. I don't have time to go back and talk about the song again. But he has changed tone and posture since coming from the Oval Office. So it could be that, or in this case, it could simply be that his role in crafting the BEE laws and his own benefits from the BEE legislation have made him feel like the criticism of BEE was a personal attack on him and his contribution to the South African, story and his legacy, so to speak. So before we go into BEE itself, let me give you a brief overview of Mr. Ramaphosa and Black economic empowerment. So Cyril Ramaphosa resigned from Parliament on the 14th of April 1996. At that time, he was 43 years old. He had lost the power battle in the ANC. Thabo Mbeki got deputy president. And while Cyril Ramaphosa wanted to get the position of Minister of Finance, he did not have the support from Nelson Mandela. So he left Parliament, he left active politics. He was appointed as deputy chairperson of the New Africa Investments Limited, and that's a company that was known as NAIL, which was a BEE investment holding company. NAIL was founded in 1993 and was one of the pilots for Black economic empowerment transactions in the country. Ntato Montlana was a key figure in the company's early development and became its chairperson. He was Nelson Mandela's doctor. So NAIL actually got a stake in Jonic in November of 1996 for 2.6 billion. And Jonic had significant stakes in South African breweries, Toyota, MTN, Sunday Times, Business Day, Financial Mail, Sunday Times, Business Day, Financial Mail, some of the most friendly publications towards President Ramaphosa. And you may begin to see why as a basis of this history. So he then became chairperson of the Jonic board. And this is when he became a real power player within corporate South Africa. Jonic's major shareholders at the time were also Old Mutual, the Public Investment Corporation, Rand Merchant Bank, Metropolitan, Coronation, Liberty, and Sanlam. So he would have been with the movers and shakers, the Rand lords of the time, if you will. During his time as chairperson, he sold stakes in Toyota, in the Premier Group, which is a food and beverage company. He took control of Omni Media, which owned Times Media, and increased the shareholding in MTN to 47% of Jonic. Jonic also owned, by the way, 51% of Tsogo-San, which owns the Monte Casino in Johannesburg. So Cyril Ramaphosa was also co-opted onto the boards of several companies, MTN, Times Media, SAB, Bidvest, and Alexander Forbes. In 1998, Cyril Ramaphosa led the BEE Commission. It finalized its report in 2000, and various industry and sector chapters were developed. These sectoral charters made partial Black ownership of South African companies mandatory. He left NAIL in 1999. He established Millennium Consolidated Investment Holdings in 2001. In 2002, MCI became the Alexander Forbes Empowerment Partner and got a 30% stake in the business. In 2002, MCI raised a 303 million private equity fund from Sanlam, Sasria, and the Development Bank of Southern Africa. In 2003, Standard Bank bought 15% of the company for 55 million. 2003, MCI got into the mining business with a stake in Karanga Coal and Barberton Mines. In 2004, MCI changed its name to Shanduka, which means change. Shanduka then became the vehicle for wealth building for Mr. Ramaphosa following that period in time. So between 2004 and 2012 is really when his business empire grew by leaps and bounds. And so in 2004, Shanduka took a 1.2 stake Standard Bank. In 2008, Shanduka got into the IPP business. They partnered with Aggreko, which is a London-listed provider of temporary power generation. And they actually built a gas-fired power plant at Razano Gracia, which is on the Mozambique-South Africa border on the Mozambique side. And they actually provided power to Eskom during the World Cup. In 2010, Ramaphosa became the empowerment partner for Lonmin through vendor financing. So basically, Shanduka got a loan from Lonmin for £200 million, which is about 4.8 billion today, to buy a 9% stake in Lonmin. He was able to get control of Ingwala, which was established in 2004, which held an 18% interest in Lonmin's two subsidiaries, Western Platinum and Eastern Platinum, and a 26% stake in the Akanani Platinum Project. So all of those equated to a 9% stake in Lonmin. Lonmin was then acquired much later by Sibanye-Stillwater in 2019. In 2010, Cyril Ramaphosa got control of McDonald's South Africa. At some point, he became an empowerment partner for Glencore, and in 2012, he was elected the chairperson of Optimum Coal, taking over from Bobby Godsell. Optimum is South Africa's sixth largest coal producer, and fourth largest exporter of coal. It owns two operating mines, both located in Mpumalanga. So you can see that President Ramaphosa actually did benefit quite significantly in his own name from Black economic empowerment. You can see that he was heavily involved in all of the various steps that created BEE as we know it today. So there is a personal element to this for him. Let's now get technical. What is this thing, Black economic empowerment? Let's go to the Act and see what the Act says. In the Act, broad-based Black economic empowerment means the economic empowerment of all Black people, including women, workers, youth, people with disabilities, and people living in rural areas through diverse but integrated socio-economic strategies that include but are not limited to the following. 1. Increasing the number of Black people that manage, own, and control enterprises and productive assets. 2. Facilitating ownership and management of enterprises and productive assets by communities, workers, cooperatives, and other collective enterprises. 3. Human resource and skills development. 4. Achieving equitable representation in all occupational categories and levels in the workforce. 5. Preferential procurement. And 6. Investment in enterprises that are owned or managed by Black people. So that's what BEE is in a nutshell. That's what it is. Are you opposed to it? What do you think about it? Let's start talking in the comment section. What is the history of BEE? And this is where it gets interesting. This is where it gets really interesting. BEE has been attacked by the Democratic Alliance consistently. The irony is that BEE was actually created by the biggest donors to the Democratic Alliance, the Oppenheimers. It's almost like the Oppenheimers at this stage have buyer's remorse, or that the sons of Harry Oppenheimer have forgotten the reasons why their father and Gavin Reilly spent so much time fighting for this policy. The idea of creating a Black elite within the existing corporate kingdoms was not a creation of the ANC, but was something that was conceptualized by the Oppenheimers, the Ruperts, and their captains of industry at the time. Names like Michael Spicer, Bobby Godsell, Gavin Reilly, and also Martin Kingston were the drivers of this particular idea and led to the manifestation of this idea. Martin Kingston right now is the chairman of Business for SA, and he's the chairman of the Resource Mobilization Fund, the fund that the 160 CEOs contribute to for the President's Project Management Office and for Operation Vulindlela. And they've contributed about 500 million rands in the last 2 or 3 years to that particular fund, right? So he's somebody who was very involved in all of this BEE stuff and is still somebody who's very involved in Business for SA, Business Unity South Africa. And you'll see that there's always these types of like entities that exist to manage the interests of business and to make sure business interests are protected. So Anglo-American executives in particular were the leaders in lobbying and negotiating with the ANC in Lusaka, creating relationships with the ANC in Lusaka to try to avoid the outcomes that they thought would be the worst for them and their business empires. Martin Kingston, just as a side note, a very interesting man. He played a key role in all of these BEE deals, and His first wife was Tembi Tambo, who was the daughter of Oliver and Adelaide Tambo. His second wife, Pulane Kingston, is the daughter of the former Health Minister Manto Chabalala Msimang and the ANC Treasurer General Mendy Msimanga. So you can see, it's also said that Tito Mboweni was the best man at his wedding. So you can see that these are people who had deep connections within the ANC, deep connections within business, and were orchestrating this particular policy framework historically. So one of the earliest BE deals was actually done by Anglo-American. In 1994, Anglo-American split the Johannesburg Consolidated Investment JCI to sell Jonic and JCI to the National Empowerment Consortium and the African Mining Group. It was at the time the biggest black empowerment deal in South African corporate history. And the picture, as you can see, are Cyril Ramaphosa and Nikki Oppenheimer. The Oppenheimer family, and this is what motivated them, they were concerned that their vast empire in South Africa would be nationalized. What is the basis of that concern? Well, that's exactly what happened in Zambia with the copper mines that they used to own there. Anglo-American entered the copper mining business in Zambia in 1927. So they were owners of the Nkana and the Mufulira mines, which are now part of the Mopani copper mines. They developed those mines. Those mines became operational in 1932. So when Zambia got independent, shortly thereafter, there was a process of nationalization of those mines, and eventually those mines were fully nationalized. That story is a story for another day because the nationalization was then reversed later. China has a big role now. There's a lot we can talk about just that. But in 1990, in the 80s even, as they were beginning to do scenario planning at Anglo and preparing for what would be either a peaceful democratic transition or anarchy or some kind of dictatorship, they were like, look, we need to facilitate things. We need to get things going. And the fear that they had was that the ANC would pursue more Marxist and socialist policies when they got into power in the absence of market-friendly alternatives that they would then have a stake in. One thing that big business will not do is to leave their profits in the hands of fate. So they took fate into their own hands and they started reaching out to ANC leaders in Lusaka, Thabo Mbeki, all of these guys. They were meeting with them in Lusaka, negotiating with them. There were three competing views of how to deal with the impacts of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. One view was for the Reconstruction and Development Program, right, which was more on the socialist side of things. Then there were two capitalist views on how the role of the state should be post-apartheid. One group was known as the Macroeconomic Research Group, which was a group of ANC-aligned academics called MERG, MERG. They advocated for an economic policy stance which was focused on redistribution and restructuring of the economy, different from the RDP model. And it was a capitalist model which was framed on Keynesian thinking. They wanted state-led social and physical infrastructure investment programs focused on housing, education, health, the National Health Service, and the physical infrastructure investment, which would be growth drivers, which would then be followed by a more sustainable second growth phase in which the private sector investment would kick in more forcefully as growth picked up. So they viewed the role of the state as being critical. It was Keynesian in its design. John Maynard Keynes is one of the thinkers who was led to this type of appreciation of the role of the state. The opposing view, which was a neoliberal view, was put forward by an entity which was known as the South Africa Foundation, which was a consortium of South Africa's 50 most powerful companies. Most of those companies owned by Rupert, owned by the Oppenheimers, right? And they put together a document known as Growth for All. This document then became what was basically chosen by the ANC in 1996 as their economic policy, which was then called Growth, Employment and Redistribution, GEA. As it pertains to the role of the state, GEA framed government as being fundamentally constrained by market responses. It aimed at a reduction in the government budget, tight monetary policy, privatization of state assets, and trade liberalization. The key figures who supported this were Thabo Mbeki, Trevor Manuel, Tito Mboweni. You can see that those are the people who then became the captains and the controllers of the South African economy. This was from the Chicago School of Economics. It advocates for a small role of the state and the privatization of services and the provision of services through the private sector. This was a privatization and private sector first, neoliberal, Thatcherite, Reaganomics approach. I'm going to one day do a full deep dive into Thatcherite Reaganomics and why those economics don't work for a developmental state like South Africa, and also why they caused a lot of poverty in America, a lot of inequality in America, and also caused economic problems that continue to exist in the UK up to now. So if you're wondering why there is such a large private security industry in South Africa, a large private healthcare sector, a large private education sector, while the state is not providing these services at quality, and why certain decisions were not made in the early 90s to make sure that education, for example, is equal and at quality for all. This is the reason. This is the reason. The RDP was abandoned, the Reconstruction and Development Program. The merge idea was also abandoned. What was then picked was this particular GEAR model, the growth, employment, and redistribution. Another name for this is trickle-down economics. They were saying, let's grow the economy. Let's allow these big businesses to thrive. Let's allow these people who were already prospering during the apartheid model of capitalism. Let's just they will employ everybody. They'll take care of everybody. For a brief period of time, it seemed that this was working, right? Because in the early 2000s, there was a lot of economic growth, but it was concealing the inherent contradictions within that particular system. Because if you don't build your skills base, if you don't fix certain things, you're not going to have economic prosperity for a long time. So we're going to have a conversation about that one of the days. But this is the reason why. Because this was what was chosen, this GEAR approach, and it led to the consequences which also played out in the UK, played out in America with market crashes and all of that. This Thatcherite approach to economics has notoriously proven to lead to worse outcomes for those who are on the side of the poor or the middle class. It's not a good economic approach. And in fact, there is a lot of merit to a Keynesian approach, whether it's new Keynesian economic thought, something we'll talk about later. But I want you to understand what led to that debate. So at that time, that's when BEE was emerging as a concept. And this idea of creating a black elite within the existing corporate kingdoms was being manifested, right? So this was not a creation of the ANC. Just like GEAR, it was a creation of big business to create this vanilla cake of the apartheid capitalist ecosystem and then sprinkle at the top some chocolate, sprinkles at the top of the vanilla cake, but the cake is still in essence a vanilla cake. So Anglo-American, as I've said, was one of the leading companies in making sure they did this. Big Capital was aware that they had control of the South African economy. Several families were dominant. Anglo-American was linked to the Oppenheimers. Rembrandt was linked to Rupert's. Sanlam, which family is Sanlam? I can't think of the family right now, but I know Old Mutual is the Gordons. Anglo-Val, that's the Menels and the Hersoffs. So those companies, Anglo-American, Rembrandt, Sanlam, Old Mutual, Liberty Life, Anglo-Val, they controlled in the 90s, early 90s, 86% of the JSE. These guys knew that if there is a transition to democracy, when there is now a conversation about the economy, it will face us. We are the economy. We are the guys who are operating under apartheid. We are the guys who are funding the apartheid ecosystem and the regime. Some of these companies like Naspers, very actively involved. Rembrandt, by the way, Rupert's father, Anton Rupert, was a member of the Broederbond. He was funded as a part of the Afrikaner Nationalist project to really take over the economy. It was all part of a political economic project. So the Malans, the Verwoods, all of these people who created these entities had a political agenda in doing so. Even state-owned enterprises like Eskom and ISCO, all of these entities were created with a political economic agenda. And that was known. It was understood. So they were like, look, we've been having all of this economic control. When these guys come in, they're going to take over everything, and we don't want that. So let's actually give them some smolanyana slices of the cake, see how we can incorporate some of them into the equation. And this may be the reason why Chris Hani was killed, because he was not for all of this. And he was going to be an impediment because he was very popular. So I don't know who killed him, but it's very clear that none of this BEE stuff could have happened if he was around, or would have happened without robust criticism from him, because he used to speak about people driving around in Mercedes-Benz and selling out the revolution for that. Can't remember the exact quote, but he spoke about that quite often. So there are generally two phases of BEE that are considered to have existed back then. BEE phase 1 can be considered as the period between 1990 and 1998. See, this was happening before 1994, some of the stuff. The difference between phase 1 and phase 2, phase 1 was focused mostly on increasing black ownership of shares in major corporations. This was driven by big business. The same people who attack BEE now, it's their creation. They came up with this, right? Then there was a shift. On the 29th of May 1998, Thabo Mbeki gave a speech in the National Assembly on a debate about reconciliation and nation building. So the speech that he gave there has now become known as his two-nation speech. In his address, Mbeki argued that national unity and reconciliation between black and white South Africans were impossible dreams if socio-economic disparities which prevented black South Africans from exercising their citizenship rights to the same extent as white South Africans were not rapidly overcome. Mbeki's speech and more general accusations that BEE was simply enriching a small number of well-connected politicians and business people in the context of persistent poverty eventually led government and business to repackage the concept as broad-based black economic empowerment. So at the beginning it was black economic empowerment, then it became broad-based black economic empowerment. So you can see how that transition happened. Under this umbrella, ownership is only one of the 7 main criteria which the empowerment credentials of businesses in South Africa are assessed on. The others being management representation, employment equity, skills development, preferential procurement, enterprise development, and corporate social investment. So these criteria have underpinned the second phase of BEE, which is considered to be from 2000 onwards, when a number of industry empowerment charters, the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act, and a series of codes of implementation were generated. So that's how we got BEE and broad-based Black economic empowerment, right? My thoughts, my reflections on everything that's been happening in the conversation right now. My problem with most of the criticism of broad-based Black economic empowerment in general is that when it comes from the right-wing voices, right, especially some of the big business voices as well, it's not just a criticism of ownership, but of affirmative action and restorative justice. It's also this criticism that creates the perception that black doctors, black engineers are 30% doctors, that they're not qualified, similar to what we saw being raised by some of the rugby players where they were still being called quota players, even though they were excellent world-class rugby players in their own right. And even though it was necessary, because the South African Rugby Union didn't want to include players who were coming from black rugby unions and black teams back in the 90s. It actually went to the courts. Mandela was taken to the courts. They didn't want. So even though now they're stronger together, we must remember that even the rugby community was pushing back. So there's this criticism of BEE that tries to then paint a picture that everyone who is in corporate who's black, if these laws exist, is there on a question mark. That's something that we must be aware of. But the issue I have with this criticism is that, remember, by design, ownership is only one of 7 main criteria upon which the empowerment credentials of businesses in South Africa are assessed. The others, management representation, employment equity, skills development, preferential procurement, enterprise development, corporate social investment, right? The blanket criticism based on the billionaires who were created by BEE is then used to attack the other aspects, which I don't think are justly attacked, because you can still see in corporate South Africa massive disparities in the representation at top management, at senior management. There's data that shows that there's not necessarily any equity there, not necessarily any representation of the dynamics in South Africa, not because they're not talented black professionals who could actually operate at that level, because they're still being overlooked and underrated. There is a necessity for a continued focus on inclusion in the workplaces and in universities. Let me speak on education, for instance, and this idea of 30% doctors, etc., etc. If a student from a rural area has to swim across a river or walk 10 kilometers a day to get to school and home, if that student from this rural area going to this rural school gets an 85% average in maths, physical science, and has 6 distinctions, I believe they deserve to be enrolled in medical school more than someone who was living in Hyde Park, going to St. David's or St. John's and receiving world-class tuition, world-class tutoring, being driven in Uber Blacks from the school back home with all of the computers, with functional science lab. I think without affirmative action policies, the poor and the marginalized students, brilliant as they are, would not get opportunities they deserve. Because the one who got 85% in a rural school is more brilliant than the one who got 90% in St. John's, an elite school with everything. If you get 85% with nothing, that's like somebody running 2 hours, 5 minutes marathon with bare feet. And then Eliud Kipchoge runs it at 2 hours wearing the Nike shoes that give him the bounce and all of that. Who is the better marathon runner? If you think about it in that scenario, it's not who has merit. Of course, Eliud Kipchoge is talented, and it doesn't take away from the 90% student. They still got 90%. They are brilliant. But the person who got 85% in a rural school, in my opinion, is deserving. Further, I also hold the view that public universities, which are funded by the state, have a role in addressing the social needs and addressing the impacts of colonialism and apartheid. I don't think that they operate like Ivy League institutions in America without an obligation, even though those think they also have an obligation. So if you're funded by the state, you have a state function. And the state function is to make sure that communities have skills that they need and that the historical imbalances of apartheid are addressed. The Bantu Education Act was passed in 1953 with the explicit intention of excluding black people from being able to access quality education. Hendrik Verwoerd said, "What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when he cannot use it in practice? There is no place for him in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor." Right? Supposed to be fetchers of water, cutters of wood, all of that stuff. That was how he conceptualized black identity and black role in the economy. So now universities do have an obligation to make sure that there's enough doctors who are going to be able to work at Baragwana, to work at the various township clinics. Otherwise, if it was just about the people who went to all the top private schools, what would change about the South African dispensation? What would change? Nothing would change. Nothing. Right? So that's my issue with some of this criticism of BE, is that they start by painting this picture of like, no, we don't like Patrice Motsepe, we don't like Cyril Ramaphosa and how they got all of this money, and they are the few people who won along with Tokyo Sakwale, Saki Makozoma and those others. But then they start the conversation about the 30% and making it seem as if black people who got into medical school somehow got in there with 60% or 50%. You'll never get into medical school, Wits or whatever, with those kind of marks. You will never. You won't see that medical school classroom. You will never touch a cadaver with those kind of marks. You will never. It's still very difficult to get into med school. But if you got an 85% from a rural area, you're going to get in. Because that's great. That's a good mark. That's how it works. And I think it's correct for it to work like that. I don't know if you think it shouldn't, but I think it should. And if you think it shouldn't, let's have a conversation. Don't come with insults. Come with points. We'll read them and then we'll engage respectfully. I'm always in the comments talking to you guys because I appreciate the engagement. So my problem with the criticism also, when it comes from billionaires like Rupert and Oppenheimer, is that this is their creation. It was their creation designed to co-opt the ANC elites into their companies. They're the ones who wanted the vanilla cake with the chocolate sprinkles. To then turn around and act as if they had no role in the problem that they're criticizing, to me, is insincere and hypocritical. I do agree with the criticism of the BE that it has benefited the ANC elites. I think many people agree with that. There's a more robust criticism, actually, that also needs to be outlined, that BEE actually stifled the real economic redress that was required in the early 90s. Redress such as support for institutions such as the taxi associations and the National African Federated Chamber of Commerce, right, which was formed in 1964 and focused on the upliftment of black businesses during apartheid, right? Support for the Foundation of African Business and Consumer Services, which was founded in 1988. There have been associations and entities trying to create wealth for the black community which predate 1994. Instead of giving these entities the right kind of economic support, the right kind of investment, because you do need to give funding and support to entities such as that. Even if you look at the success of South Korea, at some point the administration was picking sectors and allowing for those sectors to thrive, right? Those chaebols, those families that got to dominate the South Korean economy are a product of state intervention. They're not just a product of just like the free market, as it were. No, the state played a role. But instead of playing a role in supporting taxi associations, the African Federated Chamber of Commerce, as I said, they went in and they did this BEE stuff. And this was supposed to be the poster for the transformation and redress that was necessary. And big business was happy with that because they could keep on keeping on. And by the way, look at the JSE now. Same companies are still big. Naspers, Remgro, Raynet, which is just another entity which Rupert owns. And then you look at the other ones, all of these big mining houses, still the same. The Sasols, the Old Mutuals, you go to Sandton, it's the same companies that were big pre-1994 that are big now. Some of them have been renamed. Some of them had mergers and acquisitions and they've been swapped around. But the Oppenheimers, the Ruperts, if you go to that rich people list, it's only Patrice who's there, and he got his wealth as a result of a BEE deal where he was given mines in 1997. From where? From Anglo-American. Then he got Sasol. The same entities that I spoke about earlier are still dominating the South African economy with a few black faces. And that criticism that BEE blocked a more progressive approach to building business is something that I think is still valid now. But it's not the criticism that is coming from, when they're saying they don't want black economic, they don't even want those types of support. They don't want any support. They just want, listen, the state should play no role. Let the free market dominate. The problem is that in South Africa, the apartheid capitalists are still the capitalists controlling the South African economy. Those companies, those entities, they didn't win in the free market. They played the game during apartheid and colonialism. They never had competition in the true sense of the word because 80% of the population was prevented from competing. Now, let me just finish talking about taxi associations and how they could have played a role in wealth building. Taxi associations get a bad reputation and, they behave poorly sometimes, the taxi drivers, but they could have been real wealth drivers with support. Instead, they got predatory financing. From who? From Rupert. They've been paying high interest rates for decades, much higher than civilians pay for a vehicle, for a business which is a proven business. They've been told to pay these high interest rates because they're high risk and they have no collateral. It has been and remains one of the biggest shakedowns, in my opinion, from the financial sector and one of the ways in which wealth creation has been inhibited in the black community, that lack of real financial support for the taxi industry. The same applies to Uber now, by the way. There are some companies which are charging these drivers $2,800 a week for vehicle financing. $2,800 to have what are these cars? The Agias and some of these other Uber Go cars. I'm not talking about the Kias and all of that. Just those Kia sedans. No, the baseline. They're being charged these exorbitant amounts of money for that vehicle. $2,800 a week. Think about that. Does that make any sense? If you look at the costing, many of these drivers, if it were not for this predatory type of vehicle financing, could be in strong economic positions right now. They could be investors right now. They could be employers right now if they were not being hit with these predatory financial arrangements. So I think some of the criticisms of BEE are valid and some of them are disingenuous and insincere from people like Elon Musk. I think we actually need TEE. TEE, that's what we need. Township Economic Empowerment. Give funding to small businesses in the townships and give them business support. Not only that, give young people who have skills to get the resources they need to start workshops, labs, and studios. Many startups, all of these startups to celebrate Steve Jobs startup with what's the other guy's name? Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak. These started in their garages, right? People are not able to get that kind of funding in the townships, right? Many startups are initially funded by the bank of mom and dad, friends and family, and they start in mom's garage. But it's not always possible to do that, Ekasi. It's not always possible, right? Because in the townships, we have a situation where 60% of the population is living in poverty. Many young black skilled graduates end up not pursuing their creative and entrepreneurial dreams and just getting a job because they can't find funding for their ideas. There's no bank of mom and dad. So if we want to see homegrown Elon Musks, let's give these young people money to buy equipment, to create their digital and tangible products. There are so many stories that could be filmed, that could occupy most, if not all, of Netflix if we gave these. You know how much stuff goes down in the townships on a regular basis? Just in one house with a back room, there are 50 stories. If you watched Scooty's Nice growing up, you know that just one Bungulu can create a lot of content with Sismay and Radio Gogo. Just one Bungulu is enough. You know. So just imagine you extrapolate all of the stories these young people have been living through with the Blessers, the Hoshkar fathers, the Hoshkar mamas, the yellow boats with the yellow thighs. How many stories could we hear? Huh? How many murder crime documentaries would we have on Netflix? I'm just trying to show you that if we gave these people cameras, microphones, and said, do your thing, here's some funding, go make us a story, go make us a documentary, that could occupy a significant part of Netflix, bigger than Nollywood, bigger than Bollywood. The South African creative space can take up a larger chunk than Nollywood and Bollywood. I stand on that. Supply Netflix. But they don't have funding. They don't have funding, right? There are people who have finished engineering. They want to do interesting things in the townships, but they don't have funding. So they go work for the big engineering firm. And then guess what happens? They get married, they get kids, they start getting far from that dream, they start having new financial obligations, they start getting a little bit older. And some of them may, in their late 30s and early 40s, go and try that idea, but many give up. And that's why we're not seeing a generation of Elon Musks who are homegrown. That's why. So we need township economic empowerment, and the state has to play a role because the state has to create the outcomes that it needs. All of these startup nations that you hear about, the state played a big role. Even in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley didn't fund itself. It was funded by the American government for defense purposes. Come on now. The state played a role. It was a Keynesian thing, not so much a Thatcherite thing. The state has always had a role to play if you really want to see key development. Even the Marshall Plan, all of that. The state was playing a role. The money didn't fall out of the sky. It didn't come from business. It came from the government. Okay, so let's put aside this idea that we just need to have laissez-faire, capitalism, and then we will see the outcomes that we want to see. No, that's not true. But guess what? If you agree with my idea of township economic empowerment, I hope you realize that that's Black economic empowerment. Township economic empowerment is Black economic empowerment. And some of the people who are opposed to Black economic empowerment would still be opposed to that. They really would. Right now, South African banks are ranked 20th in the world. Number 19, I think, actually. But they are ranked 96th on the funding of small businesses. The banks that are owned by the Ruperts and all of that. They don't believe in township economic empowerment. If they did, they would be empowering the townships and making profits from that. But they don't. They don't. Even Capitec was making a lot of money for decades, right? From Black customers predominantly. They didn't open a business entity up until, I think, last year or 2 years ago, that Capitec opened small business financing. They're now the largest bank in terms of market capitalization, but they only started trying to provide funding for small businesses just 2 years ago. So these critics of BEE. By the way, Michel Leroux is one of the biggest funders of the DA as well. These critics of BEE, they are the architect of BEE, and they've had ample opportunity to fund businesses in the township, but they always tell black people that they don't have collateral, they're high risk. That's why South African banks rank 96th in funding small business, but they rank 19th in the world. Whether it's TEE or BEE, some people just don't like the idea of black people having economic empowerment. And there's a word for that. Let's talk in the comments.